In Havana, the presence of an American military mission is used by Fulgencio Batista as a cloak of democratic respectability. In fact, he rules by force alone. He uses his power for one purpose: to enrich himself.
Everyone has heard something about socialist Cuba, but not many know how it came to be, how one man by the name of Fidel Castro was able to create a popular movement in a small island only 90 miles away from the United States that would challenge a superpower. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1926, and was the son of a Spanish farmer and Spanish-American war veteran, Angel Castro y Agriz. The mother was the household servant of his father, later a mistress, and his second wife Lena Ruz Gonzalez. Fidel would be born in Byron, Cuba, and would be raised in an urban area. As the only wealthy family for miles, he would play with the impoverished kids his age while he attended Catholic and private schools. By the late 1940s, Fidel Castro at the time had made a name for himself at the University of Havana, where he was studying to become a lawyer. Castro participated in public debates on the school campus, made public speeches, and organized protests against the corrupt government, setting the expectations and motivations of his organization as well as rules and goals. Recruitment was fast due to the fact that a lot of people were against theft and misappropriation of funds, high unemployment, abuse, and injustice of the current government. People knew it was all attributed to bad politicians, but these workers lacked class consciousness and could not see it was due to the current economic system that was imposed on them. This was in the heyday of McCarthyism.
Instinctively follow the strongest man. In 1952, he is Fulgencio Batista. Batista's takeover spawns Fidel Castro. The two, Batista and Castro, will clash.
1952, facing a certain presidential electoral defeat, Fulgencio Batista, a military officer, would launch a coup declaring himself president. Batista already had a strong influence in the government. Just a decade earlier in 1933, he and a handful of other sergeants would overthrow the president at the time, controlling Cuba through a string of puppet presidents. But now in complete power and receiving financial, military, and logistical support from the American government, Batista suspended the Constitution and revoked most political liberties, including the right to strike. Batista then aligned with the wealthiest landowners who owned the largest sugar plantations and presided over a stagnating economy that widened the gap between rich and poor Cubans. Eventually, it reached the point where most of the sugar industry was in U.S. hands, and foreigners owned 70% of the arable land. Batista's repressive government then began to systematically profit from the exploitation of Cuba's commercial interests by negotiating lucrative relationships both with the American mafia, who controlled the drug, gambling, and prostitution businesses in Havana, and with large U.S.-based multinational companies that were awarded lucrative contracts. Fidel Castro recruited members of the Orthodox Party, which had a lot of young, anti-Batista people in it, majority middle class, but not necessarily anti-imperialistic. The other recruitment also came from other cells they organized in different cities from other organizations. Castro would say he helped train exactly 1,200 men and spoke to every single one individually and politically. One member of the Orthodox Party would include Orlando Castro, who would later become a millionaire in Venezuela. During this time, Castro was a lawyer that was being supported by militants, defending the poor for no charge, mainly because he was devoting his full time to the revolution. During this time, Castro would already have sympathy for Marxism, stating, "If we hadn't read Marx's books on political theory, and if we hadn't been inspired by Marx, and Lenin, we couldn't possibly have conceived the idea of a revolution in Cuba." Castro's organization would train at the University of Havana, drills and assembling and reassembling rifles, and firing practice with blank rounds, leaving the actual shooting practice at the firing ranges in Havana, disguising comrades as good upstanding members of the bourgeoisie like businessmen, depending on what they looked like and their style and abilities. They would register them in hunting clubs and then bring them to their clubs to practice clay pigeon shooting, legally being able to train 1,200 men. However, Castro never mentioned any concrete plans for an assault, but would mobilize the recruits several times for false drills to prepare them mentally for an operation. Fidel Castro would already have some combat training and experience by this time. Castro was in Colombia years earlier by the 1940s during the Bogotazo when Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, a progressive candidate for the presidency in Colombia who had massive support among the country's working class and was seen as the candidate most likely to win. Both conservatives and traditional liberal elites along with the U.S. were very concerned at this prospect. Gaitan would be assassinated, resulting in riots and a direct confrontation with the army. Even some policemen joined in on the rioting. Fidel Castro would also have some training in the Callao Confis affair in the summer of 1947. A group of approximately 1,200 armed men was assembled in Cuba. The leaders of the resistance believed that with their own strength and the assistance of the Dominican underground, they would be able to overthrow the U.S.-backed dictator of the Dominican Republic, Rafael Trujillo. The preparations of the force were not kept very secret, and its intent was very public. In September 1947, the United States government pressured Cuban President Ramon Grau into arresting the entire force, and the invasion never took place. The weapons of the forces were also confiscated. The exiles were set free within a few days. The incident was given the name Callao Confis affair after the area in Cuba from where the invasion was supposed to be launched. But now ready for a direct attack, on the night of July 25th, Castro's recruits were divided into small groups with each having its own leader. No one but only a certain few knew about the location of where they were going to meet. They would all meet on a secret farm by Havana at 11 p.m. in preparation for the objective, which was to attack the Moncada and retrieve weapons and then distribute them among the people to start a revolution and also take over a radio station so they can broadcast their manifesto to the entire island. Arriving at the location, the rebels had hidden their weapons in a nearby location. Weapons that Castro was in charge of raising funds and purchased from a local gun store. Using primarily shotguns, the most effective for the close combat they were expecting. They also had one M1 rifle, 1.45 Thompson submachine gun, and the rest were .22 rifles and shotguns. All the rebels dressed like Cuban sergeants to create confusion, only being able to identify each other through the regular shoes they were wearing. 160 men in all, 40 were used in Niamo to take the barracks and prevent a counterattack from the Central Highway, and the rest 120 men were used for the assault on Moncada. The plan of the operations was to take over the hospital behind the Moncada and also take over Audiencia with Castro Group with 90 men to directly take over the Moncada. Leaving the farm at 4:45 a.m. July 26, 1958, ready for the operation, 16 cars all reached the entrance by 5:15 in the morning. Some of their vehicles would even have Pro Batista flags to avoid any suspicion. Taking down the chains covering the pathway, the first car stopped and reaching to their first objective to neutralize the guards and take their weapons. At this point, Castro sees two other guards about 20 meters away, turning their back towards Castro but facing the men of the first car. Castro pulled up alongside them, and his car door halfway opened, holding a shotgun in his right hand and a handgun in his left hand. The two guards would turn around and still point their weapons. Castro would then jump out of the moving car, driving the car into them. Suddenly the rest of the men got out with weapons drawn, then one of them started shooting, causing multiple shots to be fired, losing their surprise advantage. All the gunfire caused confusion, and by the time some of the men got out of their cars, they went into the wrong building. Castro was able to run into the building and reorganize the group since they were able to occupy the front post. Continuing with the plan, some of the men headed to the weapons room. Once they were there, they were in for a surprise. They realized an army band was sleeping there. Apparently, the weapons had been moved to the main barracks. By this time, everybody was shooting, and in those early moments, soldiers were running around putting on their shoes, getting dressed, and organizing. Most of the commanders did not even sleep on the base, they were in their own homes. Realizing that there was no possible way of achieving the objective, taking the barracks from more than 1,000 Cuban troops, awake and heavily armed. With the gunfire growing, Castro decided to have everyone pulled back. During the retreat to the entrance, Castro notices a .50 caliber machine gun on the roof of the main building pointing directly at them, and a man fidgeting with it. With his .22 rifle, Castro starts firing at the man to prevent him from preparing the gun and shooting. Each time the man attempted to fire, Castro would shoot at him, while everyone retreated into their cars and everyone was leaving. He was able to get into the last car, but the car was completely full. While sitting in the back seat, suddenly, out of nowhere, he sees one of his men on the right being left behind. Castro gets out of the car, tells the man to get in, and orders them to leave. Being left behind, all by himself and in the middle of the street with his .22 rifle, full of adrenaline, Castro is looking around where he can run to and try to get away. Out of nowhere, another car drives up, a man named Santana, apparently realizing Castro was left behind. He came back for him. Castro and a group of rebels would flee into the mountains to continue the armed struggle. Soon after, the group of men would be captured by Batista's men. In total, 20 Cuban soldiers were killed, with only 8 rebels killed, but more than 70 rebels were taken prisoner. Some were killed on the spot or tortured in prison. Castro would represent himself in court since he was a lawyer. During the trial, Castro would take full ownership of the rebellion. He, however, did not use his spotlight to fight his case, but to publicly condemn Batista. This would be where Castro makes his famous speech quoting, "You may condemn me, history will absolve me." Castro would be sent to 15 years in prison. Others, including his brother Raul, would be sent between 7 to 13 years. During incarceration, Castro would spend his time studying Marx, Lenin, and other leftist writers.
The Isle of Pines is 25 miles off the southwest coast of Cuba. In the summer of 1955, it is filled to capacity with more than 2,000 political enemies of Fulgencio Batista.
Support for the rebellion grew, and so did sympathy for the revolutionaries because of the military rule. A letter-writing campaign started by the mothers of the political prisoners, seeking their release, followed by an appeal supported by intellectuals, academics, writers, and politicians. Castro had married Mirtha Diaz-Balart years prior, whose father was very close friends with Batista. Batista had even attended their wedding years before Batista's coup. Some say that also helped Castro's release. Having control of the whole country and the backing of the United States, Batista did not feel threatened and actually viewed the release as a good gesture for his public image. Then, just like that, after serving 22 months, Castro and a group of rebels would be released. Castro would return to politics immediately and created a new political movement called July 26th Movement, named after the rebellion. The movement would grow popular because of the bold failed attempt. Now the movement under constant government surveillance, more political violence and unrest broke out. Castro and his brother Raul with other rebels would flee to Mexico to train for another armed struggle against Batista. This is where Fidel would first meet El Che, whom himself was fleeing from Guatemala after the American support coup ousted the popular President Arbenz.